The Rocky Mountain wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the rotting porch of Blackwood Lodge, where Jake Morrison stood holding a crowbar and questioning every decision that led him here. The $5,000 purchase seemed like a steal until he realized why. 3 previous owners had died under mysterious circumstances, and the locals refused to even drive past the property after dark. Jake wasn't just any buyer, though. 15 years as an Army Ranger before becoming a Forest Service officer had taught him to spot danger, and right now, every instinct screamed that he wasn't alone. Behind the false wall he'd just torn down sat a massive steel safe, and inside, stacks of gold bars worth $215 million alongside documents bearing the signatures of people who were supposed to be dead. The rumble of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley, black SUVs with tinted windows moving fast up the mountain road. Jake's satellite phone had no signal, his truck's tires had been slashed, and the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away. But who were these people, and why had they been watching him since the moment he'd signed the deed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's mind raced as he stared at the documents scattered across the lodge's dusty floor. Senator William Hartley's signature jumped out at him first, the man who'd supposedly died in a plane crash 3 years ago. Below it, Governor Marcus Reed's unmistakable scrawl, another victim of a convenient heart attack. The gold bars gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through broken windows, each one stamped with serial numbers that meant nothing to him but clearly meant everything to whoever was speeding up that mountain road. The engine noise grew louder. Jake estimated maybe 5 minutes before they reached the lodge. He'd been in worse situations in Afghanistan, but this felt different, more personal. These people had been watching him, waiting. The slashed tires weren't a warning, they were preparation. He grabbed his service pistol from the holster and quickly surveyed the lodge's interior. The main room offered little cover except for a stone fireplace and some overturned furniture. A narrow staircase led to a second floor that groaned ominously under his weight during yesterday's inspection. The back door opened onto a cliff face with a 60-foot drop to jagged rocks below. Jake stuffed several documents into his jacket pocket, his hands shaking slightly as adrenaline coursed through his system. Whatever conspiracy these papers documented, it was worth killing for. The previous owners hadn't died in accidents. They'd been silenced. The vehicles were closer now. Jake could distinguish at least 2 engines, maybe 3. Through the grimy front window, he caught glimpses of black metal between the pine trees. Professional, military precision in their approach. He'd walked into a trap, but why let him discover the safe first? Unless they needed him to open it. The combination lock showed signs of tampering, scratches around the dial suggesting previous failed attempts. Somehow, Jake had succeeded where others had died trying. His radio crackled with static, dead air. They were jamming communications too. A memory surfaced from his military days, his commanding officer's voice echoing across a training ground. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, Morrison, you don't fight fair. You disappear. Jake moved quickly to the back of the lodge, where a window faced the cliff. Below, a narrow ledge ran along the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to traverse. It was suicide, but staying meant certain death. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the valley. Voices carried on the wind, professional clipped tones coordinating their approach. Jake counted at least 4 distinct speakers. He eased the window open, wincing as the ancient frame creaked. The ledge looked even narrower from this angle, weathered stone crumbling at the edges. One slip meant a fatal plunge into the rocky ravine below. "Check the perimeter first," a voice commanded from outside. "He might run." Too late for that. Jake was already through the window, his ranger training kicking in as he found handholds in the cliff face. The wind whipped around the mountain, threatening to tear him loose. Below, a rushing stream promised a cold, crushing death. The front door splintered behind him. Heavy boots thundered across the lodge's wooden floors, shouts of surprise as they discovered the open safe, then angry commands as they realized their quarry had vanished. A head appeared at the window Jake had just vacated, a hard face topped by military short grey hair. The man scanned the cliff face but missed Jake pressed flat against the rock 20 feet to the left, hidden behind a jutting outcrop. Spread out, the man barked. Check every trail, every hiding spot. He's got what we need. Jake remained motionless until the voices faded and the search moved away from the lodge. Only then did he begin the treacherous journey along the ledge, the stolen documents burning like fire in his jacket pocket. He had evidence of something huge, something worth multiple murders. But first, he had to survive long enough to figure out what it meant. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Jake's truck crunched up the gravel road toward Whispering Pines Lodge. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with renovation plans and budget calculations. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold an hour ago, but he didn't care. Today marked the beginning of his new life. The lodge looked even more imposing in daylight. 3 stories of weathered timber and stone rose from a clearing that had once been manicured, but now surrendered to wildflowers and encroaching forest. The wraparound porch sagged on the left side, and several shutters hung at drunken angles. Jake counted at least a dozen missing roof shingles from where he stood. He pulled out his phone to snap photos for insurance purposes, but found no signal. Of course, he'd have to drive 20 minutes down the mountain to get even one bar. The isolation that made this place perfect for his needs would also make it challenging for everything else. Jake unloaded his tools and camping gear, hauling everything onto the porch. The realtor had warned him the electricity was disconnected and the well pump would need the power restored to function. He'd planned for a few days of roughing it while he assessed the major systems. The front door's lock turned with surprising ease. Inside, dust motes danced in streams of sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The main room was cavernous, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that climbed to the vaulted ceiling. Mismatched furniture sat shrouded in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Jake walked through the space slowly, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Despite the neglect, the lodge's bones were solid. The timber framing was sound, and the stonework showed the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Someone had built this place to last. In what had been the dining room, he found a collection of framed photographs hanging askew on the walls. Most showed groups of men in hunting gear, posing with rifles and displaying their kills. The images spanned decades, judging by the changing fashions and the progression from black and white to color. One photo caught his attention. A group of 6 men standing in front of the lodge, probably from the 1980s based on their clothing. They looked prosperous, confident, successful businessmen on a hunting trip most likely. One face seemed familiar, though Jake couldn't place where he might have seen it. He made his way upstairs, testing each step for structural integrity. The second floor held 8 guest rooms, each with its own small bathroom. Most were in better condition than he'd expected, requiring mainly cosmetic work. The third floor had clearly been private quarters for the owners, a master suite and 2 smaller bedrooms. It was in the master bedroom that Jake made his first real discovery. Behind a loose section of wainscoting, his flashlight beam revealed scratches in the wood that looked deliberate. When he pried the panel away, he found a small cavity containing a tarnished brass key and a yellowed piece of paper with numbers written in faded ink, 15 to 23, 8 to 34 to 19 to 42. The key was old, probably for a padlock or strongbox. The numbers could be a combination, though for what he had no idea. Jake pocketed both items and continued his exploration. Back on the first floor, he began checking the kitchen and utility areas. The pipes looked intact, and the electrical panels seemed adequate for a basic renovation. As he examined the basement access behind the kitchen, he noticed something odd about the floor plan. According to the survey maps he'd studied, the lodge's footprint was larger than what he'd seen so far. Somewhere there was space unaccounted for. Jake spent an hour measuring and comparing his rough sketches to the official dimensions. The discrepancy was significant. nearly 200 square feet. Either the survey was wrong, or there was a hidden room. He started in the basement, a low-ceilinged space that housed the defunct furnace and water heater. The fieldstone walls looked original, but along the north wall he found what he was looking for. The mortar between several stones was a different color, cleaner than the rest. Using a crowbar from his toolkit, Jake worked at the stones until they shifted. Behind them lay darkness and the musty smell of long closed air. His flashlight revealed a narrow passage leading deeper under the lodge. The passage opened into a room about 10 feet square, completely hidden from the official floor plan. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, most empty now except for a few moldering cardboard boxes. But against the far wall sat something that made Jake's pulse quicken. A heavy steel safe, painted green and built like a bank vault. It looked untouched by time, its chrome handle gleaming despite the decades of darkness. Next to the handle was a combination lock with 6 numbers. Jake pulled out the paper he'd found upstairs and read the sequence again. 15 to 23, 8 to 34 to 19 to 42. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the combination dial. Whatever was in this safe, someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide it. The question was whether Jake really wanted to know what secrets lay buried in his new home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lodge's weathered deck as Jake sipped his coffee from a chipped mug he'd found in one of the kitchen cabinets. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the safe, and sleep had become elusive. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind through the pines set his nerves on edge. He'd spent hours examining the photographs and documents, trying to piece together their significance. The images showed what appeared to be a mining operation, but not the kind that filed environmental impact reports. Heavy machinery scarred pristine wilderness, and men in expensive suits stood beside massive excavation sites that definitely weren't on any official maps Jake knew of. The financial records were equally troubling. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and payments to officials whose names Jake recognized from local government. The amounts were staggering, enough money to buy silence, influence, and apparently entire sections of protected forest land. A distant rumble broke through his thoughts. Jake set down his mug and moved to the deck's edge, scanning the access road that wound up through the trees. A black SUV emerged from the forest, its tinted windows reflecting the morning light like dark mirrors. Behind it came another, identical vehicle. Jake's pulse quickened. In his 5 years as a forest ranger, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people and situations. Right now, those instincts were screaming danger. He slipped back inside, moving quickly but quietly to the bedroom where he'd hidden the safe's contents. The documents were wrapped in plastic and tucked inside his sleeping bag. Not sophisticated, but it would have to do. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the back door, but the sound of car doors slamming told him he was too late to simply walk away. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice carried easily across the morning air, polite but with an undertone that made Jake's skin crawl. "We'd like a word with you." Jake stepped onto the front deck, keeping his hands visible but ready. 2 men in dark suits stood beside the vehicles, their posture casual but alert. The speaker was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes like chips of ice. His companion was younger, broader, with the kind of build that came from hours in the gym and a job that occasionally required physical persuasion. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Jake kept his voice steady, drawing on years of dealing with difficult situations in the wilderness. The older man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm Richard Caldwell, and this is my associate, Mr. Torres. We represent certain business interests in this area. We understand you recently purchased this property." "That's right. Is there a problem?" Caldwell stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. "Not necessarily. We're simply interested in making you an offer. This is remote property, difficult to maintain, expensive to renovate. We're prepared to pay you triple what you invested cash, with a quick closing." "Thanks, but I'm not interested in selling." Jake crossed his arms, studying the men carefully. Everything about them radiated money and power, but also something darker. Just got the place, still exploring what it has to offer. The younger man, Torres, shifted slightly, his jacket opening just enough to reveal a shoulder holster. The movement seemed casual, but Jake caught it. His mouth went dry. "Mr. Morrison," Caldwell continued, his tone remaining conversational, "I think you misunderstand the nature of our offer. This isn't really a negotiation. There are complications associated with this property that you're not equipped to handle." "What kind of complications?" "The kind that can be very dangerous for someone who doesn't know how to navigate them properly." Caldwell's smile widened slightly. The previous owner, Mr. Henley, learned this the hard way. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Henley died of a heart attack." "Did he?" Caldwell tilted his head slightly. "Interesting how the heart can fail when a man faces too much stress, when he perhaps discovers things he shouldn't, or makes choices that put him at odds with the wrong people." The threat was clear now, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Jake's mind raced, calculating distances, exits, options. The men were blocking his path to the truck, and the forest, while offering cover, would also isolate him completely. "I'll need to think about your offer," Jake said carefully. "Of course, but don't take too long. Our patience, while considerable, isn't infinite." Caldwell reached into his jacket, slowly, keeping eye contact with Jake, and withdrew a business card. He placed it on the deck railing. "You can reach us at that number. We'll expect to hear from you within 48 hours. The men returned to their vehicles with the same casual efficiency they'd displayed throughout the encounter. Jake watched them drive away, waiting until the sound of engines faded completely before picking up the card. It was blank, except for a phone number. As he stood there, holding the card, Jake realized his simple renovation project had just become something far more dangerous. Whatever secrets the safe contained, someone was willing to kill to protect them, and now they knew exactly where to find him. The morning air bit at Jake's face as he stood outside the lodge, staring at the mysterious contents spread across his kitchen table through the frost-glazed window. 3 hours of sleep had done nothing to convince him this was all a dream. The photographs, documents, and gleaming gold bars remained stubbornly real. He'd spent the darkest hours before dawn researching what he could on his spotty internet connection. The names in those documents weren't random. They belonged to some of Colorado's most influential people. Senator Patricia Wynne, whose environmental initiatives had made her a rising star in Washington. Marcus Delacroix, the mining magnate whose company had pivotal contracts across 3 states. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose research institute received millions in federal funding. What connected them all was Blackstone Industries, a company that officially didn't exist, but whose letterhead appeared on half the documents in that safe. Jake's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Morrison, you copy?" He grabbed the handset from his belt. "Yeah, Tom. Go ahead. Got a situation up on Eagles Peak Trail. Hiker found what looks like a body. You're closest to the access road." Jake's blood chilled. Eagles Peak was less than 5 miles from the lodge. "How long has it been there?" "Hard to say. Looks like it's been there a while, but the cold's kept it preserved. State boys are en route, but they need someone up there now to secure the scene." "Copy that. On my way." Jake grabbed his gear and headed for his truck, his mind racing. A body, 5 miles from a safe full of secrets that could destroy powerful people. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence, but 15 years as a ranger had taught him that mountains didn't believe in coincidence. The drive up the winding access road took 20 minutes, his truck growling in low gear as it climbed the steep switchbacks. He found the hiker, a pale, shaky college kid named Dennis, waiting by the trailhead marker. "It's about a 1/4 mile up," Dennis said, wrapping his jacket tighter around himself. "Just off the main trail, in that little clearing where the creek bends." Jake knew the spot. It was remote, surrounded by dense pine forest, the kind of place where something could stay hidden for months. "You touch anything?" "God, no. Soon as I saw what it was, I backed away and called 911. Good man. State police will want to talk to you, so stick around. Jake hiked up the familiar trail, but every shadow between the trees seemed to watch him now. The forest felt different, charged with a menace he'd never noticed in his years patrolling these mountains. When he reached the clearing, he understood why. The body lay partially concealed beneath a fallen log, dressed in what had once been an expensive suit. The mountain cold had mummified the remains, leaving features recognizable enough to see this had been a man in his 50s, well-groomed, with soft hands that had never seen manual labor. But it was what Jake found in the corpse's jacket pocket that made his hands shake. A business card, Blackstone Industries, and a name, David Richardson, senior investigator. Jake photographed the scene with his phone, careful not to disturb anything, but his mind was already spinning. An investigator for the Phantom Company whose documents were sitting in his kitchen. Dead, in the wilderness Jake patrolled, close enough to the lodge that whoever put him here might know about the safe. The sound of approaching engines echoed up from the access road. State police, probably the coroner too. Jake pocketed the business card, telling himself he was preserving evidence, but knowing he was really protecting himself. If Blackstone Industries was willing to kill to protect their secrets, that card connected this body directly to what he'd found. 2 hours later, after giving his statement and turning the scene over to the state investigators, Jake sat in his truck at the trailhead. Detective Sarah Martinez had asked good questions, too good. She'd wanted to know if he'd seen any unusual activity in the area, any strangers, any signs of disturbance. She'd been particularly interested in the timeline, pressing him on when he'd last patrolled this specific trail. Probably been there 6 months, she'd told him as they watched the body bag being loaded into the coroner's van. Maybe longer. Animals had been at it some, but the cold keeps things intact. 6 months. Jake thought about the lodge's previous owner, old Henrik Volkov, who died 7 months ago. Had Henrik known about David Richardson? Had he known about Blackstone Industries? As Jake drove back toward the lodge, a black SUV with tinted windows passed him going up the mountain. Nothing unusual about that. Tourists and hunters use these roads all the time. But something made him check his rearview mirror, and he watched the SUV slow as it approached the Eagles Peak access road. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The state police had left the scene an hour ago. There was no legitimate reason for anyone to be heading up there now, unless they were looking for something the police might have missed. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows as Jake stared at the contents of the safe spread across the lodge's main table. 3 stacks of gold coins caught the sunlight, but it was the manila envelope that held his attention. Inside were documents that made his blood run cold, bank records, photographs, and what appeared to be coded communications dating back 15 years. He picked up one of the photographs again. A man in an expensive suit shaking hands with someone whose face had been deliberately scratched out. In the background, Jake could make out the distinctive architecture of the town hall in Cedar Falls, the nearest city to his property. The timestamp showed it was taken in 2009. The bank records were more damning. Transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through shell companies, all tied to something called Mountain Development Initiative. Jake recognized several names from the Cedar Falls City Council, including the current mayor, Richard Blackwood. A rustling sound outside made him freeze. Through the window he caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line, too deliberate to be wildlife. Jake quickly gathered the documents and shoved them back into the envelope, then closed the safe. The combination clicked softly as he secured it. His radio crackled to life. "Morrison, this is dispatch. We've got reports of suspicious vehicles in your area. Black SUV with tinted windows. You see anything unusual?" Jake grabbed the radio, his eyes still fixed on the forest beyond his windows. "Negative. Dispatch. All quiet up here." He paused, realizing he might have just lied to his own colleagues. But something told him that involving the authorities right now could be a fatal mistake. The radio went silent, and Jake moved away from the windows. He needed to think, but first he needed to secure the evidence. The safe felt too obvious now. If someone else knew about it, they'd eventually find a way in. He grabbed a waterproof bag from his gear and carefully placed the envelope inside, along with several of the gold coins. The sound of an engine echoed through the valley, growing closer. Jake peered through a crack in the wooden shutters and saw it, a black SUV winding up the narrow road toward his lodge. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched it approach. Moving quickly, Jake headed to the back of the lodge, where a loose floorboard concealed a space he'd discovered during his initial inspection. He secured the waterproof bag beneath it, then grabbed his rifle from the gun rack. Whatever was in that envelope, someone was willing to come all the way up here to get it. The engine noise stopped. Car doors slammed shut. At least 2, maybe 3 people. Jake positioned himself where he could see the front approach while remaining hidden. Through the gap in the shutters, he watched 2 men in dark clothing emerge from the SUV. They moved with military precision, one covering while the other advanced. Professional. This wasn't some random break-in. "Jake Morrison," a voice called out from the yard. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Jake didn't respond. The man's tone was calm, almost friendly, but everything about the situation screamed danger. He'd learned to trust his instincts during his years as a ranger, and right now they were telling him to stay very quiet. "We represent certain business interests in the area," the voice continued. "It's come to our attention that you might have found something that doesn't belong to you. We're prepared to make this worth your while." The second man had disappeared from view, probably circling around back. Jake shifted position, trying to keep both potential entry points in sight. The lodge's old construction worked in his favor. Thick walls and limited windows meant fewer ways in, but it also meant fewer ways out. A shadow moved past the kitchen window. Jake raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. He'd never shot another human being, and he prayed today wouldn't be the first time. "Mr. Morrison, let's be reasonable here," the voice called again. "We know Harold Vance left something behind when he died, something that could cause a lot of unnecessary trouble for a lot of people. We're offering you a clean solution." Harold Vance. So that was the previous owner's name. Jake filed that information away as he heard footsteps on the back porch. The old boards creaked under someone's weight, each step deliberate and measured. His radio suddenly crackled again, the sound abnormally loud in the tense silence. "Morrison, respond. We've had reports of shots fired in your area." Jake's blood chilled. There'd been no shots fired yet. Someone was feeding false information to bring backup to the scene, probably to create chaos or provide cover for whatever these men planned to do. He reached for the radio to respond, but a voice from directly outside the back door stopped him cold. "That's far enough, Ranger. Put your hands where we can see them." The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Jake barely noticed as he spread the contents of the safe across his kitchen table. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows across photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance notes written in cramped handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up another photograph, this one showing Senator Patricia Hawkins shaking hands with a man Jake didn't recognize outside what looked like a warehouse. The timestamp on the photo read 3 months ago. Jake set it down and rubbed his eyes. He'd been at this since dawn, trying to make sense of what he'd stumbled into. The gold coins were the least of his worries now. What he'd found was a carefully documented conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of state government and possibly beyond. A knock at the door made him freeze. Through the window, he could see a black SUV parked in his driveway. 2 men in suits stood on his porch, and they definitely weren't selling insurance. Jake quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the metal box. His heart hammered as he carried it to his bedroom and slid it under the bed, then returned to answer the door. "Mr. Morrison?" The taller man flashed a badge too quickly for Jake to read the details. "Agent Collins, FBI. This is Agent Martinez. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the property you recently purchased." Jake forced himself to appear calm. "Of course. Come in." The agents entered, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. Collins was lean and sharp-featured, while Martinez was broader, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. Both carried themselves with the easy confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Nice place," Collins said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly impressed by the modest cabin. "Quite a change from that old lodge up the mountain." "I'm still working on renovations," Jake replied, gesturing toward the couch. "Can I get you coffee?" "We're fine." Martinez remained standing, positioning himself near the window. "We understand you've been doing some exploring in the lodge. Found anything interesting?" The question was casual, but Jake caught the underlying tension. These men weren't here for a routine inquiry. They knew something, or suspected it. "Just the usual stuff you'd expect in an abandoned building," Jake said. "Old furniture, mice, decades of dust." "Why? Should I have found something specific?" Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're investigating some irregularities related to the previous owner, Marcus Henley. You remember him, right? The man you bought the property from?" "Sure, though I only met him once, at the closing. Seemed eager to sell." "I'll bet he was." Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Did he mention why he was selling? Family property like that usually has sentimental value." Jake shrugged. "He said he needed the money for medical bills. His wife was sick, I think." The agents exchanged a look that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Collins pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "When you were exploring the lodge, did you notice any safes, hidden compartments, that sort of thing? A safe?" Jake tried to sound surprised. "No, nothing like that. Should I have been looking for one?" "Mr. Henley was involved in some questionable activities before his death," Collins explained. "We have reason to believe he may have hidden evidence on the property, evidence that could be dangerous in the wrong hands." "His death?" Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Marcus is dead?" "Car accident, 2 days after your closing," Martinez said, watching Jake's reaction carefully. "Very unfortunate. Lost control on a mountain curve." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Jake's wall clock. He could feel both men studying him, waiting for some tell that would give him away. His military training kicked in. Steady breathing, relaxed posture, maintain eye contact but don't stare. "That's terrible," he said finally. He seemed like a nice enough guy. Collins closed his notebook with a sharp snap. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be direct with you. If you find anything unusual on that property, anything at all, you need to contact us immediately for your own safety." "My safety?" "Marcus Henley made some very dangerous enemies," Martinez explained. "The kind of people who don't leave loose ends. If they think you might have something that belonged to him." He left the sentence hanging, the threat clear but unspoken. Jake nodded slowly. "I understand. If I find anything, you'll be the first to know." The agents left their cards and departed as abruptly as they'd arrived. Jake watched from his window as the SUV disappeared down the mountain road, then immediately went to check on the hidden box. It was still there, but he knew his cabin was no longer safe. As evening shadows crept across the valley, Jake began planning his next move. Whatever Marcus Henley had died protecting, it was bigger than Jake had imagined. And now they knew he had it. Jake's hands trembled as he spread the photographs across his kitchen table. The harsh morning light streaming through the windows made the images even more disturbing. Senator Richard Blackwood's face stared back at him from multiple shots, shaking hands with known crime bosses, exchanging briefcases with men in expensive suits outside abandoned warehouses, and in one particularly damning photo, standing beside a shallow grave in what looked like the same forest that surrounded Jake's lodge. Each photograph was dated, going back nearly 15 years. Someone had been building a case against Blackwood methodically, patiently, but who? And why had they hidden the evidence in his lodge? Jake picked up the leather journal again, flipping through pages of meticulous handwriting. The entries read like a detective's notes. tracking Blackwood's rise from local prosecutor to state senator, documenting a trail of corruption, murder, and blackmail that stretched across 3 counties. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Jake had purchased the lodge. B knows I'm getting close. Changed my will today. Everything goes to the state if something happens to me. At least this way, the truth might survive even if I don't. The evidence is safe. Only one person knows where it is, and I trust him with my life. The signature at the bottom made Jake's blood run cold. Detective Marcus Webb, Pine Ridge Police Department. Jake remembered Webb, a grizzled veteran cop who'd worked these mountains for decades before dying in what the papers called a tragic hiking accident 3 weeks ago. The same week Jake had seen the lodge listing appear online at an impossibly low price. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hello? Mr. Morrison? The voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of menace. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jake's mouth went dry. I'm sorry, who is this? A friend of your predecessor. Detective Webb was a very thorough man, but unfortunately he developed some misguided ideas about justice. I'm hoping you're more practical. I don't know what you're talking about. A soft chuckle. Please, Mr. Morrison. We know you found the safe. We know you've seen the contents. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away. Jake looked out his window, scanning the tree line. Were they watching him right now? What do you want? A simple exchange. You give me what Webb stole, and you get to continue your quiet life, renovating your charming little lodge. Everyone wins. And if I refuse, then you'll discover that these mountains can be very dangerous. Accidents happen all the time. Just ask Detective Webb. The line went dead. Jake's hands shook as he gathered the photographs. Webb hadn't died in a hiking accident. He'd been murdered. And now the same people who killed him knew Jake had their secrets. He needed help, but who could he trust? If Blackwood's corruption ran as deep as Webb's notes suggested, it could involve anyone: police, judges, local officials. The journal mentioned names Jake recognized, pillars of the community he'd thought were above reproach. A knock at his door made him freeze. Through the window he could see a black SUV parked in his driveway, its windows tinted dark. 2 men in suits stood on his porch, their posture screaming federal agents or private security. Jake quickly shoved the photographs and journal into a backpack, along with the flash drives. Whatever was on those drives, people were willing to kill for it. He couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. The knocking became more insistent. Mr. Morrison? We just want to talk. Jake slipped out his back door, grateful for the dense forest that surrounded his property. He'd spent months hiking these trails, learning every path and ravine. If he could reach his truck without being seen, he might have a chance. He crept through the underbrush, the backpack heavy on his shoulders. Through the trees he could see more vehicles arriving. This wasn't just a friendly conversation. They'd come in force. His truck sat in a small clearing 50 yards away. Jake took a deep breath and made his move, sprinting across the open ground. He'd almost reached the driver's door when a voice called out behind him. Going somewhere, Mr. Morrison? Jake spun around to find a tall man in an expensive suit emerging from the tree line. The man's smile was cold, predatory. You know, Detective Webb thought he was clever too. Hiding evidence, playing detective, thinking he could bring down powerful people with his little collection of photographs. The man stepped closer. But mountains have a way of claiming people who don't know their place. Jake's hand found the truck's door handle. Webb was right, wasn't he? About all of it. Webb was a dead man the moment he started digging into things that didn't concern him. The question is whether you're going to be smart enough to learn from his mistake. Jake yanked open the door and dove inside, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the man lunged forward. Gravel sprayed as Jake gunned the accelerator, racing down the mountain road with Webb's evidence and his own life hanging in the balance. The silence in Jake's truck felt oppressive as he drove the winding mountain road back to the lodge. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a threat, every curve ahead a potential ambush. The manila envelope containing photocopies of the safe's contents sat on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. He'd made 3 stops in Millbrook, the bank, where he'd secured the originals in a safety deposit box, the post office, where he'd mailed copies to his brother in Denver with strict instructions not to open unless something happened to him, and Miller's General Store, where old Pete Miller had looked at him with knowing eyes and handed him a box of 30-06 ammunition without being asked. "Heard you might be having some wildlife trouble up your way," Pete had said, his weathered hands steady as he rang up the purchase. "Sometimes the best way to deal with predators is to let them know you're not easy prey." The message was clear. Word traveled fast in mountain communities, and apparently Jake's situation hadn't gone unnoticed by the locals who'd watched these mountains for decades. As his truck climbed toward the lodge, Jake's radio crackled to life. "Morrison, this is dispatch. You copy?" He reached for the handset, grateful for the familiar routine of ranger business. "This is Morrison." "Go ahead, Sarah." "Got a report of suspicious activity near the old mining road, about 2 miles from your location. Hikers spotted men in tactical gear moving through the woods. Thought you should know." Jake's blood went cold. The old mining road was the back way to his property, the route someone would take if they wanted to approach the lodge unseen. "Roger that. I'm in the area. I'll check it out." "Jake?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "Maybe call for backup on this one. Something feels off about it." "Will do." He clipped the radio back to his belt, knowing he was lying. There wasn't time for backup, and he couldn't risk involving other rangers in whatever was coming. The turnoff to the mining road appeared ahead, marked only by 2 weathered posts that most people would drive past without noticing. Jake pulled over and cut the engine, grabbing his rifle from the gun rack and checking the load. The weight of the weapon in his hands was reassuring, a solid reminder that he wasn't completely defenseless. He left the truck hidden behind a stand of pine trees and began working his way through the forest, using every skill he'd learned in his years of backcountry patrol. The afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that could hide a dozen men if they knew what they were doing. It took him 20 minutes to reach a vantage point overlooking the old mining road. What he saw there made his stomach drop. 3 black SUVs sat parked in a rough semicircle, their tinted windows reflecting the surrounding trees like dead eyes. Men in dark clothing moved with military precision, checking weapons and studying what looked like architectural plans spread across the hood of the lead vehicle. Jake counted 8 of them, all armed with assault rifles and wearing tactical gear that spoke of serious money and serious intent. These weren't local hired muscle or desperate criminals. These were professionals, and they were here for him. One of the men, older than the others with silver hair visible beneath his tactical cap, pointed toward the lodge and barked orders that Jake couldn't quite hear. The others nodded and began spreading out, moving through the trees with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Jake's mind raced through his options. He could try to pick them off one by one, but 8 against 1 were terrible odds, especially when the 8 were clearly trained operators. He could retreat, call for backup, and hope the cavalry arrived in time, or he could try something desperate enough that they might not expect it. He thought about the documents in that safe, about Judge Harrison's signature on papers that had sent innocent people to prison, about the money that had flowed through offshore accounts while families were destroyed. These men were here to bury the truth along with anyone who'd seen it. The silver-haired leader raised his hand, and the team began moving up the mountain toward Jake's lodge. In a few minutes, they'd discover he wasn't there, and then they'd start hunting. Jake made his decision. Instead of retreating or trying to defend the high ground, he began working his way down toward the parked SUVs. If these men wanted to play professional soldier, he'd remind them that sometimes the best tactics were the simplest ones. The first vehicle was unlocked, keys still in the ignition for a quick escape. Jake smiled grimly as he reached into his pack and pulled out a small device he'd hoped never to use again, a remote detonator left over from his demolition training in the military. Sometimes the best way to change the rules of engagement was to eliminate the enemy's exit strategy. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. The black and white image showed three men in expensive suits standing beside a construction site, their faces clearly visible despite the decades that had passed. He recognized Senator Blackwood immediately, the same predatory smile, the same cold eyes. The other two faces were familiar from newspaper headlines: Marcus Hendley, the real estate mogul, and Vincent Torres, who'd built a casino empire across 3 states. The construction site behind them bore a sign that made Jake's blood run cold: Clearwater Resort, future home of family recreation. He knew that site. It was now Clearwater Lake, a popular fishing destination about 30 miles south. The resort had never been built. According to local history, the project had been abandoned after environmental concerns were raised about the pristine watershed. But the documents spread across the kitchen table told a different story. Jake picked up a manila folder labeled Clearwater Disposal Manifest. Inside were shipping receipts, chemical inventories, and disposal certifications, all dated from the months before the resort project was supposedly cancelled. His forestry training had taught him to recognize hazardous material classifications, and what he was reading made his stomach churn. Barrels of industrial solvents, containers of heavy metals, drums of chemical waste that should have been transported to specialized facilities hundreds of miles away. Instead, according to these documents, everything had been dumped into the excavated foundation of the never-built resort. Then the whole site had been flooded to create an artificial lake. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just corruption or fraud. This was environmental terrorism on a massive scale, poisoning a watershed that fed into the regional water supply. Thousands of people had been unknowingly exposed to contaminated water for nearly 3 decades. A loose sheet of paper caught his attention, a handwritten note in the margin of one document. The writing was barely legible, but Jake could make out the words, "B wants insurance." Said the old man's getting suspicious. The old man had to be Nathaniel Cartwright, the lodge's previous owner. Jake remembered Mrs. Henderson mentioning that Cartwright had worked for the Forest Service. If he'd discovered what was happening at Clearwater... Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah: "Can't find anything about Morrison Group in public records. It's like they don't exist. Be careful." Another buzz, this time from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like Cartwright." Ice flooded Jake's veins. Someone was watching him. Someone knew exactly what he'd found. He moved quickly, gathering the most damning documents and shoving them into a waterproof bag. The photographs, the disposal manifests, the correspondence between Blackwood and his partners, everything went into the bag. He sealed it and looked around the kitchen frantically, trying to think of a hiding place they wouldn't think to search. The sound of vehicles approaching made the decision for him. Jake grabbed the bag and sprinted toward the back door, but the sound of breaking glass from the front of the lodge told him he was already too late. Heavy footsteps echoed through the main room, at least 3 sets, moving with military precision. "Check the kitchen," a voice commanded. "He was just here. Coffee's still warm." Jake slipped out the back door and into the pine forest behind the lodge. The moonlight was dim, filtered through heavy clouds, but he knew these woods better than whoever was hunting him. He moved carefully, avoiding dry branches and loose stones, putting distance between himself and the lodge. Behind him, flashlight beams swept through the windows. He could hear them systematically, searching each room, their voices growing more agitated when they realized he'd escaped. "Find him," the same voice ordered. "He can't have gone far." Jake continued deeper into the forest, his ranger training serving him well. He knew where the game trails led, where the terrain would slow down pursuit, where he could move silently even in darkness. The waterproof bag was secured inside his jacket, the evidence it contained potentially worth more than his life. After 20 minutes of careful movement, he reached a rocky outcropping he'd discovered during his first week at the lodge. A narrow cave, barely large enough for one person, was hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. Jake squeezed inside and waited, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as his hunters moved in the wrong direction. His phone showed no signal this deep in the wilderness, but that was probably for the best. If they could track his movements, complete isolation was his only advantage. Jake pulled out one of the photographs and studied it again in the dim light from his phone screen. These men had poisoned an entire watershed and killed anyone who threatened to expose them. Nathaniel Cartwright had died trying to bring the truth to light, and now that responsibility had fallen to Jake. The question was whether he could survive long enough to see justice done. In the distance, he could hear dogs barking. They'd brought tracking animals. The mountain road stretched endlessly ahead as Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Sarah sat beside him, the duffel bag containing the safe's contents clutched protectively in her lap. Every few minutes she checked the side mirror, her jaw tense with the same paranoia that had been eating at him since they'd fled the lodge. "We should have gone to the police immediately," she said, for the third time in an hour. With what? Jake's voice was hoarse from exhaustion. Photos of documents that could be faked? A dead man's word against a sitting senator and God knows who else. They'd bury us before we could blink. Sarah's phone buzzed, making them both jump. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Unknown number. Don't answer it." She let it go to voicemail, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than reassuring. Jake pressed harder on the accelerator, the old truck's engine straining as they climbed higher into the mountains. The plan was simple: get to the newspaper office in Denver, find someone willing to listen, and hope they lived long enough to tell the story. But as they rounded a sharp curve, Jake's blood turned to ice. A black SUV sat parked across the narrow road, completely blocking their path. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, their postures radiating professional menace. "Jake!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. He was already throwing the truck into reverse, tires screaming against asphalt. In the rearview mirror, another SUV emerged from behind a stand of pine trees, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. "The trees," Jake said, scanning the dense forest on either side of the road. "We go on foot." Sarah was already moving, shouldering the duffel bag as Jake killed the engine. They burst from the truck simultaneously, crashing into the underbrush as shouts erupted behind them. Branches tore at Jake's clothes, and pine needles whipped across his face as he pushed deeper into the forest. "This way," he called, using his ranger training to find the deer trail that would take them down toward the valley. Sarah stayed close, her breathing labored but determined. Behind them the sounds of pursuit grew louder, snapping branches, harsh voices coordinating the hunt. They'd been running for maybe 10 minutes when Jake heard the distinctive crack of a rifle. A chunk of bark exploded from a tree inches from his head, and he yanked Sarah down behind a fallen log. "They're not trying to take us alive," she gasped. Jake's mind raced through their options. The forest was his territory, but these weren't weekend hunters stumbling through the woods. These were professionals, and they'd come prepared. His only advantage was knowing the terrain, but that wouldn't last long against superior numbers and firepower. "There's an old mining tunnel about half a mile down the slope," he whispered. "If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them in the underground passages." They moved in short bursts, using the massive pine trunks for cover. Each time they paused, the sounds of their pursuers seemed closer. Jake caught glimpses of movement through the trees, at least 4 men spread out in a coordinated search pattern. Military or law enforcement training, definitely. A radio crackled somewhere to their left, the words too distant to make out, but the intent clear. They were being herded, driven toward some predetermined trap. Jake changed direction, angling toward rougher terrain where the thick undergrowth would slow down their hunters. Sarah stumbled, catching herself against a boulder. When Jake turned to help her, he saw blood seeping through her jacket sleeve. "It's just a scratch," she said before he could ask. "From the branches." But Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the growing realization of just how far their enemies were willing to go. These weren't idle threats or intimidation tactics. Someone had made the decision that Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen needed to disappear permanently. The sound of helicopters reached them through the canopy, distant but growing closer. Jake felt his last vestiges of hope crumble. Whatever organization they'd stumbled into had resources that went far beyond anything he'd imagined. "The tunnel," he said urgently. "It's our only chance." They half ran, half slid down the steep slope, using roots and rocks for handholds. Behind them, voices called out coordinates, the search net tightening with military precision. Jake's lungs burned, and his legs felt like rubber, but the dark mouth of the old mineshaft appeared through the trees ahead. They tumbled through the entrance just as another rifle shot cracked overhead. Inside, the tunnel stretched into blackness, musty air carrying the scent of decades-old timbers and forgotten dreams of gold. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight, its weak beam revealing rusted mining equipment and branching passages that disappeared into the mountain's heart. Somewhere in this maze of forgotten tunnels, they might find safety, or they might find their tomb. Jake's hands trembled as he disconnected the call with Marcus. The FBI agent's words echoed in his mind. "They know about you. Get out, now." But leaving meant abandoning everything he'd worked for, and worse, it meant letting Blackwood Industries continue their deadly operations. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, and immediately noticed his pale expression. "What's wrong?" "We need to leave. Marcus says they're coming for us." Jake was already moving toward the safe, his mind racing through escape routes. The mountain roads were treacherous in good weather, and with the storm that had been brewing all morning, they'd be nearly impassable. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough." Jake stuffed the remaining documents into his backpack, leaving only copies in the safe. If Blackwood's people found the lodge, they'd discover the safe eventually, but the decoy documents might buy them time. The sound of engines echoing through the valley made them both freeze. Jake moved to the window and peered through the heavy curtains. 3 black SUVs were winding their way up the access road, still about 10 minutes out but closing fast. "The back trail," Sarah said, reading his thoughts. "We can take the ATV path through the forest." Jake nodded, grateful for her quick thinking. They'd scouted the escape route days ago, but using it in a storm would be dangerous. The alternative, facing Blackwood's mercenaries, was worse. They grabbed their emergency packs and rushed toward the rear exit. Jake paused at the door, looking back at the lodge that had become both sanctuary and trap. Somewhere in his gut, he knew he'd never see this place again. The ATV roared to life, and Sarah climbed on behind him. The first drops of rain were already falling, heavy and cold, as they plunged into the forest. The narrow trail wound through dense pines, barely wide enough for the vehicle. Behind them, Jake could hear the distant sound of doors slamming and voices shouting. The search had begun. 20 minutes into their escape, the rain had become a torrential downpour. Jake's visibility was reduced to mere feet ahead, and the trail had turned into a muddy nightmare. The ATV's tires struggled for purchase on the slick rocks. "There's a ranger station about 5 miles ahead," Jake shouted over the engine noise. "We can call for backup from there." Sarah's grip tightened around his waist as they navigated a particularly treacherous switchback. The mountain dropped away sharply to their left, disappearing into mist and rain. They were halfway to the station when Jake heard it, the unmistakable whine of helicopters cutting through the storm. Blackwood Industries had brought serious firepower. "We're not going to make it to the station," Sarah yelled. "They'll spot us on the open trail." Jake veered off the main path, following a barely visible deer track that led deeper into the wilderness. It was risky. If they got lost in this terrain during a storm, they could die of exposure before anyone found them. But staying on the main trail meant certain capture. The helicopter sounds grew closer. Through breaks in the canopy, Jake caught glimpses of searchlights sweeping the forest. Professional hunters, equipped for a manhunt. The ATV suddenly lurched to one side as the rear wheel caught in a hidden gully. Jake fought to maintain control, but the vehicle tipped and sent them both tumbling into the underbrush. The engine died with a sputter, leaving only the sound of rain and distant rotors. "You hurt?" Jake asked, helping Sarah to her feet. "Just bruised." She wiped mud from her face. "But we're on foot now." The sound of the helicopters was directly overhead. Jake pulled Sarah under a rocky overhang just as searchlights swept the area where they'd crashed. The beams lingered on the overturned ATV before moving on. They waited in tense silence until the aircraft passed, then began hiking deeper into the wilderness. Jake's ranger training kicked in. He knew these mountains better than any outsider, and that knowledge was their only advantage now. As they climbed higher, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the treacherous landscape in stark flashes, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. But with each step away from civilization, Jake felt his confidence growing. This was his domain. After an hour of hard hiking, they reached a small cave Jake remembered from his early days patrolling these mountains. It would provide shelter and concealment while they figured out their next move. Inside the cave, Sarah pulled out her satellite phone. "No signal," she reported. "We're completely cut off." Jake nodded grimly. They had enough supplies for maybe 2 days, and Blackwood's people would keep searching. But they also had something their pursuers didn't: intimate knowledge of terrain that had claimed the lives of experienced hikers. "We're going to play this smart," Jake said, studying the topographic map by flashlight. "There's an old mining road on the north face. If we can reach it without being spotted, we can get down to the highway." Thunder crashed overhead, as if nature itself was taking sides in their deadly game of cat and mouse. The headlights cut through the darkness as Jake's truck bounced down the mountain road, Sarah gripping the dashboard beside him. The USB drive containing Viktor Kozlov's evidence felt like it was burning a hole in his jacket pocket. Every shadow between the trees could hide armed men, every curve in the road a potential ambush. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. "The ranger station." Jake pulled into the gravel lot, parking near the back entrance where his friend Mike Torres usually worked late shifts. The building looked reassuringly normal: cream-colored walls, Forest Service logos, American flag hanging limp in the still air. But normal had become a luxury Jake could no longer afford. Mike answered the back door before Jake could knock, his weathered face creased with worry. "Jesus, Jake, you look like hell. Get inside, both of you." The familiar smell of coffee and pine air freshener did nothing to ease Jake's tension as they followed Mike through the narrow hallway to his office. Maps covered every wall, marked with hiking trails, fire zones, and rescue coordinates. Mike shut the door and turned the lock. "All right, talk. Your message said you were in serious trouble." Jake pulled out the USB drive. "Remember when you told me about those hunting parties that never checked in properly? The ones with the expensive gear and foreign accents?" Mike's expression darkened. "What about them?" "They weren't hunting deer." Jake connected the drive to Mike's computer. "They were hunting people." The screen filled with Kozlov's files, financial records, photographs, coded communications. Mike leaned forward, his face growing pale as Jake explained what they'd discovered at the lodge. Sarah added details about the safe, the gold, the bodies in the mine shaft. "My God," Mike whispered, scanning a document that listed hunting fees in the hundreds of thousands. "These aren't just rich psychopaths. Look at these names." Jake recognized several immediately: a tech billionaire, a pharmaceutical CEO, a prominent senator. The kind of people whose phone calls could shut down investigations before they started. "The location coordinates," Sarah said, pointing at the screen. "They're all in your district, Mike. Your jurisdiction." Mike's jaw tightened. That son of a bitch knew exactly what he was doing, setting up shop here. Remote territory, minimal surveillance, and he probably had someone inside feeding him information about our patrol schedules. A sound outside made them all freeze, gravel crunching under tires. Mike moved to the window and peered through the blinds. "Black SUV," he said quietly. "2 men getting out. They're not Forest Service." Jake's blood went cold. "Back exit?" "This way." Mike grabbed his service weapon from the desk drawer and led them toward the rear of the building. "There's a trail that connects to the old fire road. You know it?" Jake nodded. He'd hiked that trail countless times during his years as a ranger. It wound through dense forest for 3 miles before intersecting with Highway 2. The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. Mike handed Jake a spare radio and a tactical flashlight. Channel 7. I'll try to stall them, give you a head start. Mike, these people... I know what they are. Mike's voice was steel. I've been a ranger for 23 years. I didn't sign up to let murderers use my forest as their private hunting ground. More sounds from the front. Voices, the scrape of tools against the door frame. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm. We need to go, now. They slipped out the back as the front door splintered open. Jake heard Mike's voice, calm and authoritative, demanding to see identification. Then they were running, flashlight beams dancing ahead of them as they plunged into the forest. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, roots and rocks threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, shouts erupted from the ranger station. A gunshot cracked through the night air. Sarah stumbled, and Jake caught her arm, pulling her forward. Keep moving. Mike knows these woods better than anyone. He'll be okay. But Jake's heart was hammering with more than exertion. Every step took them deeper into Kozlov's former hunting ground, where God knew how many innocent people had been stalked and killed for sport. The trees seemed to press in around them, branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The radio crackled to life. Mike's voice breathing hard. Jake, you copy? I'm here. They're following your trail. I slowed them down, but they've got tracking equipment. Professional gear. Jake cursed under his breath. Of course they did. These weren't street thugs. They were the cleanup crew for people rich enough to buy human lives for entertainment. Where's the nearest place we can get cell service? Sarah whispered. Jake thought quickly, visualizing the topographic maps from Mike's office. Ridge Point. Another 2 miles, but it's uphill from here. 2 miles of climbing through hostile territory, carrying evidence that could topple governments and destroy fortunes. Evidence that men were already dying to protect. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Voices, equipment, the methodical advance of professional hunters who had found new prey. The abandoned mining office stood like a wounded animal against the mountainside, its weathered boards grey as old bones. Jake crouched behind a cluster of rusted equipment, watching the building through binoculars as dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. He'd been here since 4 in the morning, and his patience was about to pay off. A black SUV wound its way up the narrow access road, kicking up a plume of dust that caught the early light. Jake's pulse quickened as he recognized the vehicle from the courthouse parking lot. Senator Blackwood stepped out first, his silver hair immaculate despite the early hour. Marcus Chen emerged from the driver's side, scanning the area with predatory efficiency. Right on schedule, Jake murmured into his radio. Sarah, you copy? I'm in position at the secondary exit, came her whispered reply. Recording equipment is active. Jake adjusted the tiny camera he'd mounted on a twisted piece of mining machinery, ensuring it had a clear view of the office entrance. The high-definition device would capture every face, every conversation if they stayed outside long enough. 2 more vehicles arrived in quick succession. Jake recognized Vincent Reeves immediately. The man's bulk was unmistakable even at this distance, but the 4th person made his blood run cold. Sheriff Daniels climbed out of an unmarked patrol car, his uniform crisp and authoritative. Son of a bitch, Jake breathed. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. The 4 men converged near the office entrance, their voices carrying on the thin mountain air. Jake strained to hear, grateful for the directional microphone he'd positioned yesterday. Becoming a liability, Blackwood was saying. Morrison's got too much evidence, and now he's involving federal agents. Should have handled this weeks ago, Daniels growled. Clean and simple, make it look like an accident. Chen shook his head. Too late for subtle now. The ranger's gone to ground, but he'll surface. They always do. Reeves spat into the dirt. What about the woman? The one from the newspaper? Sarah Chen, Blackwood replied. She's been sniffing around the courthouse records, asking questions about mining permits from the 80s. Jake's grip tightened on the binoculars. They knew about Sarah's investigation. How long had they been watching? We end this today, the senator continued. The ranger has the original documents, but he doesn't understand what he's really found. He thinks it's about illegal mining operations. Isn't it? Daniels asked. Blackwood's laugh was cold as winter wind. The mine was just the cover, Sheriff. What Morrison found in that safe is evidence of a weapons cache buried in these mountains. Military-grade ordnance that was supposed to be destroyed after the Cold War. The pieces clicked into place in Jake's mind with sickening clarity. The gold had been payment, but for what? Who had they been selling weapons to? $20 million in arms sales over 5 years, Reeves said, as if reading Jake's thoughts. Sold to the highest bidders, no questions asked. Cartels, militia groups, foreign nationals, and if that evidence surfaces now, during my presidential campaign. Blackwood's voice trailed off meaningfully. Chen pulled out a satellite phone. I've got teams positioned at every road out of the valley. Morrison can't run forever. What about the federal agent he contacted? Daniels asked. Agent Martinez is scheduled to arrive this afternoon, Blackwood replied. She'll find Morrison's body and the tragic story of an unstable veteran who couldn't handle the isolation. The documents will be dismissed as elaborate forgeries. Jake's jaw clenched. They had an answer for everything, a plan that would destroy his credibility even after death. There's still the matter of the safe itself, Chen said. Morrison might have hidden copies elsewhere. We burned the lodge, Reeves suggested. Total loss, electrical fire. Happens all the time in these old buildings. Do it. Blackwood nodded. Make sure nothing survives. The group began moving toward the mine office, and Jake knew this was his chance. The building likely contained more evidence, records of the arms transactions, maybe even names of buyers. If he could get inside while they were distracted. Sarah, they're entering the building, he whispered into his radio. I'm going mobile. Jake, wait. There are too many of them. But he was already moving, using the maze of abandoned equipment as cover. His military training kicked in, every footstep calculated and silent. The office had a rear entrance he'd spotted during yesterday's reconnaissance, a service door that looked vulnerable. The sound of voices echoed from inside the building as Jake reached the back wall. Through a grimy window, he could see the 4 men gathered around an old desk where Chen was setting up some kind of electronic device. Jake tested the service door handle. Locked, but the wood around the latch was rotted. One firm push and the door gave way with barely a whisper. He was inside the building where his enemies were planning his murder, armed with only a camera and the desperate hope that the truth might finally set him free. The abandoned mining office sat like a tombstone against the darkening sky, its weathered walls bearing decades of mountain storms. Jake crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards away, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he studied the building through binoculars. Sarah pressed close beside him, her own eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. 2 vehicles, Jake whispered, lowering the binoculars. Black SUV and what looks like a modified Jeep, at least 4 men, maybe more inside. Sarah checked her phone one last time before tucking it away. Marcus should be in position on the ridge by now. Signal's dead here, so we're on our own, until we get back to higher ground. The plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. While Marcus created a distraction from the eastern approach, Jake and Sarah would enter from the west, locate whatever Blackwood's men were after, and document everything before disappearing back into the wilderness. The evidence from the safe had led them here, to this remote site where the real treasure apparently waited. Jake adjusted the small camera in his jacket pocket and checked his sidearm one final time. Remember, we're ghosts, in and out before they know we were here. A distant crack echoed across the valley, the sound of a branch snapping under careful pressure. Marcus was moving into position. Sarah squeezed Jake's shoulder, and they began their approach, moving from tree to tree with practiced silence. The mining office was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with several connected structures that had once housed equipment and administrative offices. Yellow light spilled from windows on the eastern side, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. Jake could hear voices now, muffled but urgent. They reached the western wall without incident. Jake pressed his ear to the weathered wood and caught fragments of conversation from inside. Contractor said the main shaft extends another 200 feet. Don't care what it takes. We need those records destroyed before. Morrison's gotten too close. When we're done here. Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of Jake's name. He motioned for her to stay put and crept toward a broken window, careful to avoid the patches of broken glass that littered the ground beneath it. Through the grimy glass, he could see 4 men gathered around a table covered with mining maps and survey documents. 3 he didn't recognize, but the 4th made his blood run cold. Vincent Reeves, the man who'd tried to kill them at the lodge, stood with his back to the window, pointing at something on the largest map. The original survey crew found it in 1987, Reeves was saying. Enough radioactive material to level half the state if it fell into the wrong hands. Blackwood made sure the mine was sealed and the records buried, but these new environmental surveys are getting too close. One of the other men, a tall figure in expensive outdoor gear, nodded grimly. The federal contract was supposed to keep any real investigation at bay for another decade. Morrison's little treasure hunt has accelerated our timeline considerably. Jake's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The safe hadn't just contained evidence of financial crimes, it had held the location of an illegal radioactive waste dump hidden in the old mine for over 30 years. Blackwood Industries hadn't just been cooking books, they'd been covering up an environmental disaster that could poison the entire watershed. A sudden explosion of gunfire erupted from the eastern side of the building, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Marcus had made his move. The men inside scrambled for weapons and communication devices, their carefully controlled meeting dissolving into chaos. "Sarah, now!" Jake hissed, and they sprinted toward the main entrance as the 4 men rushed out the back to deal with Marcus's distraction. Inside, the building reeked of decades of abandonment, mixed with fresh cigarette smoke. Jake grabbed the maps from the table while Sarah photographed everything she could: documents, survey reports, and what appeared to be payment records for illegal waste disposal, dating back to the Reagan administration. "Jake!" Sarah's voice carried a note of panic. "Look at this." She was holding a manila folder labeled Project Cleanup, Phase 2. Inside were detailed plans for eliminating witnesses, with Jake's photo paper clipped to a typed summary of his daily routines. His blood chilled as he read his own death warrant, scheduled for the following week. More gunfire erupted outside, closer this time. Marcus's distraction wouldn't last much longer. "We need to go," Jake said, stuffing the most crucial documents into his jacket. "Now." They slipped back through the western entrance, just as voices approached from the south. Reeves was barking orders into a radio while the other men spread out to search the building. In minutes, they would discover the missing documents. Jake and Sarah melted back into the forest, carrying with them evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple corporate fraud. As they climbed toward the rendezvous point where Marcus waited, Jake realized their fight had just become something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. The mountain held its secrets close, but some secrets were too toxic to stay buried forever. The storm had intensified by the time Jake reached the old mining access road, rain hammering his windshield like bullets. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path that snaked up the mountainside. Behind him, he could see the distant glow of headlights. Morrison's men were still following, but the treacherous terrain was buying him precious time. Sarah gripped the dashboard as the truck bounced over a deep rut. "Are you sure this road leads anywhere?" "It connects to the fire service roads near Copper Ridge," Jake replied, wrestling with the steering wheel as they hit another pothole. "If we can reach the radio tower up there, I can call for backup." The documents from the safe sat in a waterproof bag between them, proof of decades of corruption, murder, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of state government. Morrison's logging operation had been a front for something much darker, a network that eliminated anyone who threatened their interests, from environmental activists to journalists who asked too many questions. "There." Sarah pointed ahead where the road split. "Which way?" Jake hesitated. The left fork led toward the radio tower, but it was also the more obvious route. The right fork disappeared into dense forest, heading toward the old copper mine that had been abandoned for 50 years. It would be dangerous. The mine shafts were unstable, and there were plenty of places to get trapped, but it might also be their only chance to lose their pursuers. The decision was made for him when muzzle flashes erupted in his rearview mirror. Bullets sparked off the truck's tailgate as Morrison's men opened fire from their pursuing vehicles. "Hold on!" Jake yanked the wheel right, taking the fork toward the mine. The truck's tires spun in the mud before finding traction, launching them into the darkness of the forest road. Behind them, he could hear the roar of engines as their pursuers reached the split. For a moment, Jake hoped they might take the wrong fork, but the sound grew louder. They were still coming. The road deteriorated rapidly, becoming little more than twin ruts carved by decades of mine equipment. Ancient pine trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against the truck's roof. Jake had to slow down to navigate the increasingly treacherous path, but he knew their pursuers would face the same limitations. "There's something ahead," Sarah said, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. The skeletal remains of the old mine complex emerged from the gloom. Rusted conveyor belts, collapsed buildings, and the dark mouth of the main shaft protected by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. Jake pulled the truck behind a crumbling concrete structure that might have once been a processing plant. "We go on foot from here," he said, grabbing the document bag and checking his pistol. "Stay close and watch for mine shafts. Some of them drop hundreds of feet." They abandoned the truck and melted into the maze of ruined buildings. The rain provided cover for their movements, but it also made the footing treacherous. Rusted metal and broken concrete created an obstacle course that had to be navigated carefully in the darkness. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Jake led Sarah deeper into the complex, using his knowledge of similar mine sites to avoid the most dangerous areas. They took shelter behind an overturned ore car just as headlights swept across the clearing. 3 black SUVs pulled into the complex, disgorging armed men who immediately began a systematic search. Jake recognized Morrison's voice barking orders, but there were others too, men who spoke with the crisp authority of professionals. "They've brought in specialists," Jake whispered. "Military contractors by the sound of it." Sarah clutched the document bag tighter. "We can't let them get this evidence." One of the searchers was moving in their direction, methodically checking each hiding spot with a tactical flashlight. Jake knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before they were discovered. He studied their surroundings, looking for options. That's when he spotted it, a ventilation shaft that led into the mine itself. The grating had long since rusted away, leaving an opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was risky. The mine could be flooded or filled with toxic gases. But it was better than facing Morrison's killers in the open. "The shaft," he whispered, pointing. "We can use the mine tunnels to circle back and reach my truck, or maybe find another way out." Sarah nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. They waited until the searcher moved past their position, then made their move. Jake went first, lowering himself into the shaft and dropping into darkness. The tunnel was dry, which was encouraging, and his flashlight revealed sturdy support beams that suggested this section was stable. Sarah dropped down beside him just as shouts erupted from above. They'd been spotted entering the shaft, but their pursuers would have to find another way into the mine. The shaft was too narrow for the bulkier men in tactical gear. "This way," Jake said, choosing a tunnel that led deeper into the mountain. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's men trying to force entry through the main shaft, their voices echoing through the underground chambers. The black SUVs materialized from the forest like predators emerging from shadow. Jake counted at least 6 vehicles surrounding the lodge, their engines purring with mechanical menace. Through the window, he watched armed figures spill out, moving with military precision across the property he'd foolishly thought was sanctuary. "They found us faster than I expected," Sarah whispered, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Jake's mind raced through their options. The lodge sat on a natural shelf of rock, with forest on 3 sides and a steep drop to the valley on the 4th. Beautiful for morning coffee, terrible for escape routes. The hidden passage Marcus had shown them led to the old mine shaft, but it would take time to reach, and these weren't the kind of people who'd give them that luxury. A voice boomed through a megaphone, cutting through the mountain silence. "Morrison, we know you're in there. Walk out with your hands visible and nobody gets hurt." Jake almost laughed at the absurdity. These people had already proven that getting hurt was the least of their concerns. They'd killed Marcus, destroyed evidence, and corrupted law enforcement across multiple states. Empty promises meant nothing when you were already marked for death. "The evidence," Sarah said urgently. "We can't let them get it." Jake nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the backpack containing the copied files and photographs. Even if they didn't survive this, someone else needed to carry the torch. The story Marcus died protecting couldn't end here. Moving carefully away from the windows, Jake led Sarah toward the back of the lodge. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each sound seeming to echo like gunshots in the tense silence. Outside, he could hear boots on gravel, voices coordinating positions. They were being surrounded with methodical efficiency. The entrance to Marcus's hidden passage lay behind the stone fireplace, accessible through a panel that looked like decorative stonework. Jake's fingers found the concealed mechanism just as the front door exploded inward. Wood splinters flew across the main room, followed immediately by the thunder of boots and shouted commands. "Clear the main floor. Check every room." The passage opened with a grinding whisper of stone on stone. Jake pushed Sarah through first, then squeezed in behind her, pulling the panel closed just as flashlight beams swept across the fireplace area. The space beyond was cramped and musty, carved roughly from the mountain itself. Marcus had shown them this route as a contingency, never imagining how soon they'd need it. They moved through the passage in absolute darkness, feeling their way along the rough walls. Behind them, Jake could hear furniture being overturned, voices growing frustrated as the search continued. How long before someone discovered the hidden mechanism? How long before they realized their quarry had vanished like smoke? The passage sloped downward, following what felt like a natural fissure in the rock. Jake's hands found metal rungs embedded in the stone, ladder rungs leading deeper into the mountain. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and old water. "There's light ahead," Sarah whispered. She was right. A faint glow emanated from somewhere below, not electric but natural, daylight filtering down from above. The passage opened into a wider chamber, part of the old mining operation that had first brought people to this remote valley decades ago. Rusted equipment sat in alcoves carved from the living rock, and a narrow stream trickled along one wall, probably the same water source that had drawn the original miners. Jake oriented himself, remembering Marcus's descriptions of the mine layout. This chamber connected to a series of tunnels that eventually emerged near the old lumber road, almost 2 miles from the lodge. If they could reach that exit point without being detected, they might have a chance. A distant explosion shook dust from the tunnel ceiling. They'd found the passage. "Move," Jake said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "They'll be right behind us." They ran through the tunnels, using Jake's phone flashlight to navigate the treacherous footing. The beam revealed a maze of passages, branching in all directions, some blocked by cave-ins, others disappearing into flooded darkness. Jake tried to remember Marcus's directions, but everything looked the same in the stark lead glow: rough stone walls scarred by pick and shovel, rotting timber supports, the occasional glint of abandoned rail tracks. Behind them, voices echoed through the passage. Flashlights swept the chamber they'd just left, and Jake knew their pursuers had found the trail. These weren't amateurs stumbling through the dark. They moved with purpose and training, closing the distance with every passing minute. The tunnel ahead split into 3 directions. Jake hesitated, trying to remember which path led to freedom and which to dead ends deep in the mountain's heart. Choose wrong, and they'd be trapped like rats in a maze with nowhere to run. Sarah squeezed his hand. Trust your instincts. Jake chose the middle passage, praying that instinct would prove stronger than fear. Behind them, the voices grew closer, and time was running out. The helicopter's rotors cut through the pre-dawn silence like a mechanical scythe, growing louder with each passing second. Jake pressed himself against the rough bark of a towering pine, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air. Sarah crouched beside him, clutching the waterproof case containing copies of every document from the safe. Their insurance policy and their death warrant rolled into one. "How many do you think?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching aircraft. Jake squinted through the darkness, trying to count the shadowy figures rappelling from the helicopter as it hovered above the lodge. At least 6, maybe more coming by ground. He checked his radio, confirming the GPS beacon was still transmitting to Agent Martinez's team. 20 minutes out, she'd said. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The helicopter swept across the property with a searchlight, its beam cutting through the forest like a predator hunting prey. Jake pulled Sarah deeper into the tree line as the light passed dangerously close to their position. Below them, the lodge sat dark and empty, exactly as they'd left it after setting their trap. There, Sarah pointed to movement near the main road. Vehicles coming up the access road, headlights off. Jake's stomach tightened. Senator Morrison's people weren't taking any chances this time. This wasn't about covering up a decades-old conspiracy anymore. This was about survival for all of them. The first explosion shattered the night. Jake watched in horror as flames erupted from the lodge's north wing, the very room where he'd first discovered the hidden safe. The bastards weren't even trying to search first. They were eliminating everything. The documents in the lodge, Sarah started. Were copies, Jake finished. The real ones went out yesterday, remember? Martinez has them. So do 3 different newspaper offices and 2 federal judges. He'd learned from his father's mistakes. Never keep all your eggs in one basket, especially when the basket had a target painted on it. Another explosion rocked the building. This time, the entire structure shuddered, and Jake felt the heat from their position 50 yards away. Whoever these people were, they'd come prepared for total destruction. His radio crackled softly. Martinez's voice, barely a whisper. "Owl's Nest. This is Hunter. We have visual on your position. 6 tangos around the structure, 2 vehicles on the access road, 1 helicopter providing overwatch. Sit tight." Jake keyed the radio twice in acknowledgement, not daring to speak. Through the smoke and flame, he could see figures moving with military precision around the burning lodge. These weren't local hired guns. This was a professional cleanup crew. The searchlight swept toward them again, and this time it lingered. Jake's blood ran cold as the beam fixed on a tree not 10 feet from their position. Someone had spotted movement. "Run," he whispered to Sarah. They broke from cover just as automatic gunfire erupted behind them, bullets thudding into trees and showering them with bark and splinters. The forest became a maze of shadows and deadly light as the helicopter's searchlight tracked their movement. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the old mining trail that wound up the mountain behind the lodge. It was treacherous in the dark, but it was their best chance of reaching the rendezvous point where Martinez's team waited. Behind them, shouts echoed through the trees, boots crashed through underbrush. A hunting party was forming, and they were the prey. "Jake!" Sarah stumbled, nearly pulling them both down as loose rocks shifted under her feet. The mining trail was even more unstable than he'd remembered. He steadied her, then froze as he heard something that made his blood turn to ice, dogs barking. They'd brought tracking dogs. The helicopter thundered overhead, its rotor wash whipping the trees into a frenzy. The searchlight found them again, and this time it didn't lose them. Jake could hear the pilot's voice crackling over radio communications, coordinating with the ground team. They reached a narrow ledge just as the first shots rang out from below. The shooters had night vision. Jake could tell from the precision of their fire. He and Sarah pressed themselves against the cliff face as bullets sparked off the rock around them. His radio crackled again. "Owl's Nest. Hunter is moving to engage. Keep climbing. Do not stop." The sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Martinez's FBI team engaged the attackers. Muzzle flashes strobed through the forest like deadly lightning. The helicopter's searchlight swung away from Jake and Sarah as it moved to support the ground team. "Now," Jake whispered, pulling Sarah along the ledge toward a narrow gap in the rocks he remembered from childhood explorations. "There's a cave system up here. If we can reach it." The barking dogs were closer now, their handlers shouting commands. Time was running out, and the mountain was about to become a battlefield with them caught in the crossfire. Jake's hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel, the mountain road blurring through his exhaustion. 3 days had passed since he'd handed over the evidence to Agent Sarah Chen, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The safe house she'd arranged, a modest cabin 20 miles from his lodge, felt more like a prison than protection. The call came at dawn on Tuesday. "It's over." Chen's voice crackled through the secure phone. "We moved simultaneously on all targets. Senator Blackwood, Chief Garrison, the entire network. The arrests are happening as we speak." Jake sank into the cabin's worn armchair, relief flooding through him like a dam breaking. "All of them?" "Every last one. The evidence you found was the missing piece we needed. Financial records, murder confessions, corruption spanning 3 decades. It's airtight." She paused. "You can go home, Jake. Your lodge is secure." The drive back felt surreal, autumn sunlight filtering through golden aspens as if the world had been reborn. Jake pulled into his familiar gravel driveway and sat for a moment, studying the lodge's weathered facade. Bullet holes still scarred the front door, and plywood covered the shattered windows, but it was his. Truly his now, without the weight of deadly secrets. Inside, dust motes danced in afternoon light streaming through the gaps. The hidden room behind the fireplace gaped open, its shelves empty except for cobwebs. Jake ran his fingers along the cold stone walls, remembering the terror of that first night when bullets had shattered his simple dreams of renovation. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister, saw the news. "Senator Blackwood arrested for murder? Call me!" The media had erupted within hours of the arrests. Jake's name remained protected, but the scandal dominated every headline. A corrupt senator, a dirty police chief, a decades-long conspiracy involving murder, drug trafficking, and money laundering. It was the kind of story that toppled governments and ruined careers. He'd done it. Somehow, against impossible odds, he'd survived and brought justice to people who'd thought themselves untouchable. But as evening approached, Jake found himself drawn to the spot where Marcus Chen had died. The bloodstains were gone, scrubbed away by crime scene techs, but the memory lingered. A good man had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, and Jake had nearly joined him in death multiple times. The ringing doorbell startled him from his brooding. Jake approached cautiously, old habits dying hard, then smiled when he recognized the visitor through the peephole. "Agent Chen," he said, opening the door. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." She looked different without the constant tension, younger, more relaxed. "Call me Sarah. I'm officially off duty for the next week." She held up a bottle of bourbon. "Thought you might want to toast surviving what should have killed you." They sat on the lodge's front porch, sharing drinks as the mountain sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The silence felt comfortable. Two people who'd endured hell together and emerged intact. "What happens now?" Jake asked, savoring the bourbon's warmth. "Trials, probably lasting years. You'll need to testify eventually, but witness protection protocols will keep you safe." Sarah studied him. "What about the lodge? Still planning to run a bed and breakfast after all this?" Jake laughed, surprising himself with the sound. "You know what? Yeah, I think I am. This place has good bones under all the corruption and violence. It deserves a chance at redemption, even after everything that happened here. Especially because of it." Jake gestured toward the mountains surrounding them. "Marcus died trying to expose the truth. The least I can do is honor that by building something positive from the wreckage." They drank in companionable silence as stars emerged overhead. Finally, Sarah stood to leave. "One last thing," she said, pulling an envelope from her jacket. The FBI seized substantial assets from Blackwood's organization. There's a victim compensation fund being established. This is your portion. Consider it payment for services rendered and damages suffered. Jake opened the envelope and stared at the check, his eyes widening. This is enough to completely restore the lodge. Professional contractors, proper materials, everything. You earned it. Build something beautiful here, Jake. Show the world that good can triumph over evil. After she left, Jake stood alone on his porch, breathing the clean mountain air. The hidden safe that had nearly cost him his life was empty now, its deadly secrets finally exposed to daylight. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, contractors, suppliers, anyone who could help transform his crumbling lodge into the dream he'd originally envisioned. The Morrison Mountain Lodge would rise again, built on truth instead of buried lies. Jake smiled, feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time in weeks. Sometimes the best renovations happened from the inside out, and he was finally ready to begin.